James's hands trembled as he replayed the voicemail, his chest tightening with each word. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, Angela's, but the tone was one he hadn't heard before, dripping with sweetness and flirtation. "I can't wait to see you tonight. I'll make sure James is none the wiser." The message ended abruptly, leaving James staring at his phone in stunned silence. It felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He glanced at the clock. It was already 8 p.m. The pit in his stomach told him this wasn't a misunderstanding. Determined to find out the truth, he grabbed his coat and keys. A thread of desperation pulled him toward the address Angela had mentioned in passing earlier that week, one he hadn't thought much of at the time. The Oakwood Inn? It was just a quiet boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. But now, the thought of it burned in his mind like a beacon of betrayal. Caught in the act, the drive was a blur. James's mind raced with every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. When he arrived at the dimly lit parking lot of the inn, his heart pounded in his chest. He sat in the car for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. From the shadows, he spotted Angela's car parked near the entrance. Beside it was another vehicle he didn't recognize, a sleek black sedan. His gut told him this belonged to him. Summoning every ounce of courage, James exited his car and walked toward the lobby. He paused, peering through the large windows. There she was, seated at a corner table in the small lounge, her hand resting on the arm of another man. But it wasn't just any man. As James stepped closer and the dim light illuminated the stranger's face, his blood ran cold. The man was Brian, his cousin. The realization struck like a lightning bolt. The man he'd grown up with, shared holidays and countless memories with, was the one Angela had chosen to betray him with. He watched them laugh, lean in close, and share an intimacy that felt like a knife to the heart. A dangerous gamble. James forced himself to step back before they could see him. His initial instinct was to storm in and confront them both, to demand answers, to let the rage pouring through him erupt. But something stopped him. This wasn't the moment. Confrontation wouldn't be enough. He turned on his heel and left the inn, his mind already racing with plans. This wasn't just about Angela anymore. This was about Brian too, and the double betrayal needed a reckoning. James returned home and set his plan into motion. He scoured his computer for the security software he developed years ago, a program capable of discreetly accessing and recording activity on electronic devices. Angela had often underestimated his technological skills, and tonight, her carelessness would cost her. Within hours, James had Angela's phone remotely linked to his system. Messages, call logs, and even real-time audio recordings were now at his fingertips. What he discovered in those texts was even more gut-wrenching than he imagined. "You're right, Brian," one message read. "I've wasted so many years with James. Being with you feels like freedom. I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore." The lies, the deceit, it all spilled out in cold, hard evidence. And with every piece, James's resolve hardened. A startling revelation in the days that followed. James watched Angela and Brian's affair unfold in real time, each interaction feeding his determination. But one discovery hit him like a freight train. A string of messages revealed a plan, not just for Angela to leave James, but for Brian to manipulate James into selling off shares of the family business, a company James had poured years of his life into. "He's too proud to think anyone would outsmart him," Brian had written. "Once he's out of the picture, the company will be ours." The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated, a scheme to strip James of everything he'd built. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen. The fury boiling inside him gave way to something colder, sharper, determination. Angela and Brian thought they were in control, that James was nothing but a pawn in their game. They couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, James woke early, his mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The shock of betrayal had given way to a sense of focus. This wasn't just about his marriage or his cousin's betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming control over his life and making sure neither Angela nor Brian would walk away unscathed. He began by compiling all the evidence. Every text, every recorded phone call, every digital interaction was meticulously cataloged. He knew that if he wanted to exact his revenge, He couldn't just rely on the emotional weight of their betrayal. He needed facts, irrefutable proof of their lies and schemes. One particular recording stood out. Brian's voice, dripping with arrogance, echoed through James's speakers. "Once we get the shares, we'll flip the company and walk away with more money than he could ever dream of. Angela, this is just the beginning for us." Angela's reply was equally damning. "James will never see it coming. He's always so trusting. He won't fight us." Setting the stage, James spent the next few days orchestrating his plan. The first step was ensuring that Angela and Brian felt comfortable, too comfortable. He acted as though nothing was amiss, going about his daily routine with a calm demeanor that masked the storm brewing beneath the surface. He even made a point to engage Angela more than usual, asking about her day and making small talk over dinner. It was almost comical how easily she played along, oblivious to the fact that her every move was being watched. Meanwhile, James reached out to his trusted attorney, Lisa. She was sharp, discreet, and fiercely loyal, everything he needed. Over coffee in her downtown office, he laid out his situation. Lisa listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "You have enough here to not only expose their affair, but to completely dismantle their plans," she said. "But are you sure you want to do this? Once you go down this road, there's no turning back." James's jaw tightened. "They've already made their move. Now it's my turn." Lisa nodded. "Then let's make sure they regret underestimating you." The perfect trap. With Lisa's help, James devised a strategy to protect his stake in the family business while laying a trap for Angela and Brian. Step 1 involved transferring his shares into a trust, ensuring they couldn't be accessed or tampered with without his explicit consent. Step 2 was more personal and infinitely more satisfying. James invited Angela to dinner at a high-end restaurant under the pretense of a romantic evening. She accepted without hesitation, clearly eager to keep up appearances. As they sat across from each other in the candlelit dining room, James studied her carefully. She looked radiant, her laughter light and carefree. It was almost enough to make him forget the truth. Almost. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone measured. "We've been in a bit of a rut lately. Maybe we should plan a trip, just the two of us. Get away for a while." Angela's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of guilt. But it passed quickly, replaced by a practiced smile. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Where were you thinking?" "Oh, I don't know," James replied, leaning back in his chair. "Somewhere warm. Maybe Miami?" He watched as her smile faltered, just for a second, before she recovered. "Miami sounds perfect," she said, her voice steady. James smirked inwardly. He'd struck a nerve. The unraveling later that night, while Angela slept soundly beside him, James set the final pieces of his plan into motion. Using the data he'd gathered, he scheduled a series of anonymous emails to be sent to key figures in the business world, investors, board members, and even Brian's closest associates. The emails contained snippets of conversations, incriminating messages, and details of the scheme to overthrow James and take control of the company. But James wasn't done. He also made sure the evidence was forwarded to Angela's closest friends and family, ensuring that her betrayal would be laid bare for all to see. The final touch was a personal message to Brian, sent from an anonymous account. "I know what you've been doing. I know everything. The game is over." James knew it wouldn't take long for the fallout to begin. By morning, their carefully constructed facade would be in ruins, and neither Angela nor Brian would see it coming. Morning broke with an eerie stillness. James sat in his kitchen, sipping coffee, his phone lying silent on the counter. He knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had pressed the proverbial detonation button the night before, and now he was waiting for the first explosion. At 7:15 a.m., it came. Angela's phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, her face shifting from irritation to panic as the messages flooded in. "What is going on?" she muttered, sitting upright. James watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Trouble?" he asked innocently, suppressing the smirk threatening to break across his face. Angela didn't respond. Her hands trembled as she opened a message from her best friend, Emma. The text was blunt. How could you do this to James? I just saw the emails. You're disgusting. What emails? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Her phone rang, the caller ID displaying her sister's name. Angela hesitated but answered. Did you seriously think you'd get away with this? Her sister's voice was sharp, laced with fury. Everyone knows, Angela. You've ruined everything. Angela's face drained of color. What are you talking about? She stammered. James stepped forward, arms crossed. Maybe it's time to stop playing dumb, he said, his voice cold. Angela looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. You did this? James shrugged, his calm demeanor infuriating her further. I just connected a few dots for everyone. The truth was already there. Brian's world collapses at the same time. Across town, Brian was dealing with his own avalanche of consequences. He arrived at his office to find several of his colleagues huddled in whispers. They fell silent as he walked past, their accusatory stares following him. In his office, his assistant handed him a folder with a grim expression. What's this? Brian asked, confused. The board has called an emergency meeting, she said. You're being investigated for misconduct. Brian opened the folder to find screenshots of messages he had thought were private, detailing his plans to undermine James and take over the company. His stomach churned as he realized the extent of the damage. A call from Angela interrupted his spiral of dread. What is happening, Brian? She demanded. Everyone knows. They're calling me a liar and a cheater, and it's James, Brian cut her off, his voice low and venomous. He set us up. He must have had access to our messages. Damn it, Angela. I told you to be careful. Angela's voice cracked with desperation. You said he wouldn't figure it out. Now everyone knows, Brian. What are we going to do? But Brian had no answers. A public confrontation that evening, Angela stormed into the house, her hair disheveled, her makeup smudged from tears. You've destroyed my life, she screamed at James. Was this your plan all along? To humiliate me? James stood calmly in the living room, sipping a glass of wine. No, he said, his tone icy. You did that yourself when you decided to betray me. I just made sure everyone saw you for who you really are. Angela's rage boiled over, but before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. James opened it to find Brian standing there, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. You think this is over, James? Brian hissed, stepping inside without invitation. James raised an eyebrow. Oh, it's far from over. I'm just getting started. Brian lunged forward, his temper snapping, but James anticipated the move. Calmly stepping aside, he let Brian stumble, his aggression only adding to his humiliation. You think you're untouchable, Brian spat. But this won't end well for you either. James smirked, pulling a set of papers from the table. You're right, it won't end well for you. This is a restraining order. You're not allowed within 500 feet of me or this property. So, unless you'd like to spend tonight in a cell, I suggest you leave. Angela's jaw dropped as Brian stood there, momentarily stunned. This isn't over, Brian muttered, backing toward the door. James's smile didn't waver. It was over the moment you decided to cross me. A twist revealed as Brian stormed out. Angela's anger turned into something else, fear. What have you done, James? She asked, her voice trembling. James sat back down, taking a deliberate sip of wine before answering. You thought you could take everything from me, my trust, my business, my dignity, but you forgot who you were dealing with. Angela's breath hitched as realization dawned. You've planned this from the start, haven't you? James didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Let's just say you and Brian underestimated what I'm capable of. And now, you'll both pay the price. Angela's phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then glanced at the screen. Another message, this time from her lawyer. Call me ASAP. This is serious. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of her decisions came crashing down. James, she whispered, please, let's talk. We can fix this. But James shook his head. Fix this? You made your choice, Angela. Now you have to live with it. He walked past her, leaving her standing alone in the empty living room, her world unraveling around her. Angela stood in the living room, staring at the closed door through which James had just left. Her mind raced with fragments of her shattered life. The messages, the confrontation, the smirking faces of her so-called friends who now knew her secrets. Everything she had built was crumbling. Unable to bear the silence, she grabbed her phone and called Brian. "It's over, Brian," she sobbed. "He's destroyed us." Brian's voice, usually confident, was edged with despair. "You think I don't know that? He's hit me where it hurts most, at work. The board has suspended me pending an investigation, and if the rumors are true, James is behind it." Angela's breath hitched. "What do we do?" For once, Brian had no plan. "We wait. We find a way to turn the tide. He's not invincible, Angela." But even as he said the words, they both knew the truth. James had played them perfectly. James's next move, meanwhile, James sat in his office, his eyes fixed on his laptop. On the screen were bank records and private emails, the culmination of months of meticulous planning. He had suspected Angela's betrayal long before she thought he'd noticed, and he had collected every piece of evidence he could. Now, he was ready to use it. A call came in from his lawyer, Rachel, whose voice was calm and professional. "The papers are ready," she said. "The divorce will be finalized quickly, especially with the documentation you've provided." "And the assets?" James asked. "You'll retain the business, the house, and the majority of your investments," Rachel confirmed. "Angela's case for alimony is weak, given the evidence of her infidelity." James smirked. "Perfect. Let's make sure she knows what she's losing." After hanging up, he drafted an email to Angela. It was concise, cold, and devastating. Subject: Final arrangements, Angela. The divorce proceedings have begun. You'll hear from my lawyer shortly. All joint accounts are frozen, and your access to company resources has been revoked. I've ensured you'll receive a modest settlement, enough to start over, but nothing more. Consider this the consequence of your choices. James, a desperate plea. The email hit Angela's inbox an hour later. When she read it, she felt the air leave her lungs. She tried calling James, but he didn't answer. Frustration turned to desperation, and she decided to go to his office. When she arrived, she was stopped by security. "I need to see my husband," she insisted, her voice cracking. The guard, a towering man with a stern expression, shook his head. "Mr. Sullivan has instructed that you're not permitted inside." Angela's knees almost buckled. "This is insane. He can't do this." The guard's expression didn't waver. "You'll need to leave, ma'am." Humiliated, Angela retreated to her car, tears streaming down her face. Brian's downfall at the same time, Brian's situation was growing worse. The investigation into his workplace conduct had unearthed questionable transactions that implicated him in fraud. He was suspended indefinitely, and his reputation was in tatters. One evening, he called Angela, his voice frantic. "Angela, you need to talk to James. Convince him to back off. He's behind all of this. I know it." Angela, still reeling from her own unraveling life, snapped. "And what do you expect me to say, Brian? That he should forgive us after we betrayed him? You think he'll just let it go?" Brian's silence was telling. He had no answer. "We're on our own," Angela continued, her voice bitter. "And it's your fault as much as mine." James reveals his hand that evening. James hosted a small dinner with a few close friends and business associates. The mood was celebratory, the conversation punctuated with laughter. One of his colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara, leaned in and asked, "So, how does it feel to come out on top, James?" James swirled his whiskey, a satisfied smirk on his lips. "Let's just say, it feels good to remind people that betrayal comes at a cost." As the evening wore on, James stepped outside for some air. His phone buzzed with a notification. Angela had posted a message on social media, a vague cry for sympathy about her life falling apart. James chuckled darkly. "Still playing the victim, Angela," he muttered to himself. But he wasn't done yet. He sent an email to Brian, attaching all the evidence of his misconduct and infidelity with Angela. The subject line read, "Your choices have consequences." The final straw the next morning, Brian's lawyer called him, her voice grim. "You've been served with a lawsuit," she said. "James Sullivan is suing you for breach of trust and damages to his business reputation. He has a strong case." Brian's head spun. "He's suing me? On top of everything else?" "It's serious," the lawyer warned. "If you don't settle, this could ruin you financially." Brian slammed his phone down in frustration. Angela, too, was spiraling. With her accounts frozen and her reputation tarnished, she was forced to move into a modest apartment. She avoided her former friends, too ashamed to face their judgment. Both Angela and Brian were cornered, their lives dismantled piece by piece. James, meanwhile, was already planning his next move, a public announcement that would ensure everyone knew the truth about their betrayal. Angela sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, staring at the eviction notice on her coffee table. The once vibrant woman who had thrived on attention and luxury now found herself at rock bottom. Her phone, which once buzzed endlessly with messages and calls, sat silent. Desperation had brought her to this point. She had to speak with James. She dialed his number, her fingers trembling. To her surprise, he answered. "What do you want, Angela?" James's voice was calm, almost indifferent, which stung more than if he had been angry. "James, please. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm begging you. Can we meet and talk? Just talk?" There was a pause on the other end before James replied, "Fine. Tomorrow, noon, at the cafe on 3rd Street. Be on time." The public expose the next morning, James took a different call. It was from a reporter at a prominent business magazine. "Mr. Sullivan, we received your tip about the fraud case involving Brian Spencer. Do you have further comments?" James leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Only this. Betrayal often comes from the places you least expect. I trusted these people. What they did wasn't just a personal attack. It was an assault on everything I've built. The evidence I've provided speaks for itself." By noon, news of Brian's impending trial and Angela's role in his downfall began circulating online. James had made sure the timing was perfect. The confrontation Angela arrived at the cafe early, her eyes darting nervously around the room. When James finally walked in, his commanding presence made her shrink in her seat. He didn't smile or greet her, simply sitting across the table and folding his hands. "Say what you need to say," he said flatly. Tears welled in Angela's eyes. "James, I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I need your help. I've lost everything. I don't even recognize myself anymore." James raised an eyebrow. "You don't recognize yourself? Perhaps you should have thought of that before sneaking around with Brian." Angela flinched. "I know I was wrong. I was selfish, and I let my desires cloud my judgment. But James, you're not the man I fell in love with either. You became cold, distant, obsessed with your work. I felt invisible." James's eyes narrowed. "So your solution was to sleep with my friend?" "I'm not excusing it," Angela cried. "I just want you to understand that I felt lost." James leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Do you know what the hardest part of all this was? It wasn't discovering your betrayal. It was realizing that I had spent years sacrificing for someone who didn't value me." Angela's tears flowed freely. "James, please. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'll do anything to make it right." James considered her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You can't undo what you've done, Angela. Some bridges are meant to be burned. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but it won't be with me." He stood to leave, placing a neatly folded document on the table. "What is this?" Angela asked, her voice trembling. "Divorce papers," James said, his tone as cold as the air between them. "Sign them, and this chapter of our lives will finally be over." The final blow as James walked out of the cafe. Angela stared at the papers, her vision blurred with tears. But her humiliation wasn't over. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She opened it to find her name trending online. A viral article detailed Brian's fraud, Angela's affair, and the fallout from James's meticulously orchestrated revenge. Pictures of Angela from happier days accompanied the story, juxtaposed with her current downfall. The caption read, "The Price of Betrayal: How One Woman's Choices Cost Her Everything." The cafe began to feel smaller, the whispers around her louder. Strangers stared, some even smirking. Angela grabbed her things and fled, unable to face the public humiliation. The aftermath. Brian, meanwhile, was in even deeper trouble. His company had terminated his position, and the lawsuit James filed against him promised to ruin him financially. With his reputation destroyed, Brian found himself isolated, friendless, and desperate. One night, he called Angela, but she didn't answer. For the first time, he realized he was truly alone. James's new beginning. Back in his office, James received an unexpected visitor, Rachel, his lawyer and confidant. "I have to say," Rachel began, placing a folder on his desk, "I've never seen someone execute a revenge plan so flawlessly." James chuckled, though his smile was faint. "It wasn't just about revenge, Rachel. It was about reclaiming my life. Now I can finally move forward." And move forward he did. James poured himself into his work, expanded his business, and found solace in reconnecting with friends and family. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt a life free from the shadows of betrayal. A glimmer of hope. Months later, while attending a charity gala, James met a woman named Claire. She was intelligent, kind, and refreshingly genuine. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in years, James felt a spark of happiness that wasn't tinged with bitterness. As the night ended, Claire handed him her card. "Call me if you ever want to talk about anything," she said with a warm smile. James watched her walk away, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As he left the gala, he glanced at the city lights and thought about the journey he'd endured. Betrayal had shattered his world, but it had also forged him into someone stronger, someone who understood his worth. And in that moment, James knew he was ready to start a new chapter. Angela wasn't sure how she ended up in front of James's house, her trembling hands clutching a thin folder. It had been months since their divorce, months of public humiliation, financial ruin, and loneliness. Yet here she was, standing on his doorstep, hoping for what? Forgiveness? Redemption? She rang the doorbell, her heart pounding. When the door opened, James stood there, his expression unreadable. He was different, stronger. The vulnerability she had once exploited was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that unsettled her. "Angela," he said, his voice calm but distant, "why are you here?" Angela took a shaky breath. "I know I have no right to ask this, but there's something you need to see." The secret revealed. James reluctantly let her in, motioning for her to sit in the living room. She placed the folder on the coffee table and pushed it toward him. "What is this?" he asked, eyeing her warily. "It's about Brian," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. James opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents inside. They were financial records, correspondence, and signed agreements, all implicating Brian in a far larger web of deceit than James had imagined. "He was using me," Angela said, her voice breaking. "I didn't see it at first, but after everything fell apart, I started digging. Brian didn't just betray you, James. He betrayed me too. He's been funneling money into offshore accounts and framing me as his accomplice." James's jaw tightened. "And why are you telling me this now?" "Because I know you," Angela replied, her eyes meeting his. "You're the only person who can stop him. I've lost everything, but I won't let him ruin you too." The final trap. Over the next few weeks, James and Angela worked in secret, piecing together the puzzle of Brian's elaborate scheme. Though their trust in each other was fragile, they shared a common goal: bringing Brian to justice. Angela's involvement in the plan wasn't just an act of redemption. It was a desperate bid to reclaim a shred of her dignity. James, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to close the chapter on his past once and for all. Their efforts culminated in a carefully orchestrated sting operation. Using the evidence Angela provided, James set a trap, luring Brian into a deal he couldn't resist. The day of the meeting arrived. Brian walked into the luxurious hotel suite, his usual smug confidence radiating as he greeted James. "Always knew you'd come around, cousin," Brian said with a grin. James smirked. "Oh, I came around, all right, but not for the reasons you think." At that moment, the door burst open, and federal agents swarmed the room. Brian's face twisted in shock as they cuffed him and read him his rights. Angela watched from a hidden corner, her emotions a swirl of relief and sorrow. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, though she knew the path to redemption would be long and uncertain. A bittersweet farewell after the operation, Angela met James at a quiet cafe to say goodbye. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for giving me a chance to make things right." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You did what needed to be done, Angela. I hope you find peace." "And you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. James smiled faintly. "I already have." They parted ways, and as Angela walked into the distance, James felt a profound sense of closure. A new horizon months later, James stood at the helm of his flourishing company, his life more balanced than it had ever been. He had rebuilt not only his career but also his sense of self. At a charity event one evening, he ran into Claire, the woman he had met months earlier. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Claire smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." As they swayed to the music, James realized that his past no longer haunted him. Instead, it had become the foundation for a stronger, wiser version of himself. The pain, the betrayal, and the revenge. All of it had led him here, to this moment of clarity and possibility. James sat in his study late into the night, the dim glow of the desk lamp illuminating a pile of documents. The sting operation had been a success. Brian was facing years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Angela had stepped out of the spotlight, retreating into obscurity. And yet, something about the entire ordeal gnawed at James, an unanswered question he couldn't shake. Among the files Angela had handed over was a single letter, folded and tucked away. It was addressed to Angela, and the handwriting was unmistakably Brian's. James hesitated for a moment before unfolding it. "Angela, everything is in place. Once James is out of the picture, we'll have full control. Keep playing your role, and we'll have it all. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Brian." James's stomach churned. The letter confirmed what he had suspected. Angela hadn't been an unwitting pawn in Brian's scheme. She had been a co-conspirator from the start. Confrontation the next day, James called Angela, his tone measured. "We need to talk. Come to my office." Angela arrived an hour later, her demeanor cautious. "What's this about?" James slid the letter across the desk. "Care to explain this?" Angela's face paled as she read the note. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she sighed, meeting his gaze. "I won't lie to you, James. At the beginning, I was in on it. Brian convinced me you were holding me back, that I deserved more. But I didn't realize the extent of his lies until it was too late. He used me as much as he used you." James studied her, his expression unreadable. "And I'm supposed to believe you've changed? That you're not still playing me?" Angela leaned forward, her voice trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but everything I did after you found out was real. I wanted to make it right, even if it cost me everything." James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Was her remorse genuine, or was this another manipulation? The last twist later that evening, James received an unexpected visitor, Claire. She held a USB drive in her hand, her expression tense. "What's this?" James asked, taking the drive. "Something you need to see," Claire replied. James plugged the drive into his laptop, his eyes widening as video footage played on the screen. It was surveillance from his office, captured during a time he hadn't been there. Angela and Brian were sitting in his chair, laughing as they discussed their plans. "This was a month before you found out," Claire explained. "Angela came to me after everything fell apart. She confessed everything, including that she had been recording Brian's movements to protect herself if he turned on her. She gave me this footage to show you if you ever doubted her." James stared at the screen. Brian's voice dripped with arrogance as he outlined their plot. Angela looked hesitant, her responses measured. "I don't know if this is the right way," Angela had said in the video. "It's the only way," Brian replied. "You'll thank me later." Redemption or ruin. The footage added another layer of complexity to James's feelings. Angela had betrayed him, but she had also been manipulated. Her eventual actions to bring Brian down had been pivotal in ensuring justice was served. The next day, James called Angela again. This time, his tone was softer. "You did the right thing in the end," he said when she arrived. "But that doesn't erase what you did before." Angela nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand. I just needed you to know the truth." James took a deep breath. "I don't think we'll ever be friends, Angela, but I can move forward knowing that you tried to make amends." She left his office with a sense of closure, and James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Moving forward with the truth laid bare, James focused on rebuilding his life. His relationship with Claire deepened, their shared values and mutual respect creating a foundation he hadn't realized he craved. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, James spoke candidly about his feelings. "I never thought I'd trust anyone again after what happened," he admitted. Claire smiled, taking his hand. "Trust doesn't happen all at once. It's built, piece by piece. And I'm here for every step." For the first time in years, James felt at peace. Not because his past was forgotten, but because he had faced it and emerged stronger. The end.